Arrogant and full of certainty, the architect humiliates the man who believes he is just a simple bricklayer. But when he discovers his true identity, he realizes that his actions may have destroyed everything he values most. Laura stood at the entrance of the construction site, her polished shoes contrasting sharply with the dirt-streaked ground beneath her. She adjusted her sunglasses, scanning the site with an air of authority, her eyes narrowing slightly at the mess she considered beneath her standards. The hum of machinery and the occasional shout from workers filled the air, but none of it fazed her. Laura was used to order, control, and precision, all things that seemed utterly absent from this chaotic scene. As a highly successful architect in her early 30s, Laura had made a name for herself by designing high-end buildings that embodied both luxury and elegance. Her clients were among the elite, people who expected nothing less than perfection. Today, she was about to embark on a new project, one that promised to be the crown jewel of her career. The building she was about to oversee would be a landmark in the city, an architectural masterpiece. The mere thought of it filled her with anticipation and a sense of superiority. Dressed in a tailored suit that fit her slim frame perfectly, Laura stepped onto the construction site with the confidence of someone who believed she had the world at her feet. She glanced at her wristwatch, a luxury brand, of course, and sighed in mild irritation. She had arrived exactly on time, as always, but it seemed the workers were in no hurry to meet her. Already, she felt that familiar sense of disappointment creeping in. This was supposed to be the project that cemented her reputation as one of the top architects in the country, yet it seemed that the people responsible for bringing her vision to life were entirely unprepared. Her gaze swept over the workers, men dressed in dirty overalls, sweat dripping from their foreheads as they moved heavy materials from one end of the site to the other. A deep frown settled on her face. How could these people understand the complexity of what she was about to create? How could they possibly appreciate the artistry involved in crafting something that would stand for decades, maybe even centuries, as a symbol of innovation and beauty? A low voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, would you like a hard hat?" A worker approached her, holding out a plain yellow helmet. Laura glanced at him briefly, her eyes barely registering his presence. "No, thank you. I won't be staying long." Her voice was clipped, dismissive. She turned her attention back to the building plans she held in her hands, as if the worker no longer existed. She had no patience for these small, insignificant interruptions. Her mind was focused on the bigger picture, the grand design she had envisioned, and the acclaim it would bring her once completed. But as she walked deeper into the site, a nagging discomfort began to grow. Things seemed unorganized, chaotic. The materials were scattered, the workers moved without any clear direction. It was not the well-oiled machine she expected to see. Her assistant, Maya, who had been trailing her closely, tried to keep up. "Laura, should we ask to meet the site supervisor?" Laura waved a hand dismissively. "We'll meet whoever is in charge when they're ready." Clearly, they don't understand the importance of punctuality. As she moved further into the site, Laura's frustration grew. She wasn't one to tolerate incompetence, and already she could see that this project was not going to be as seamless as she had hoped. This was meant to be her legacy, and she would not allow a disorganized crew of workers to ruin it. Suddenly, her eyes landed on a man at the far end of the site. He was bent over, lifting heavy beams onto his shoulder, his clothes stained with dirt and sweat. He looked entirely out of place in this environment, almost too involved in the physical labor for someone who should be overseeing such an important project. Laura felt a twinge of irritation. Was this the person running the site? She couldn't believe it. A project of this magnitude, and this was the man responsible? With a deep breath, she composed herself. There would be time to address these shortcomings. For now, she had to stay focused. This project was bigger than any one person. It was her chance to prove, once again, that she could create something extraordinary. As she approached the man, her heels clicking against the concrete, she prepared herself to give him a piece of her mind. Surely, this could not be the site manager. He looked far too simple, too unpolished. But whoever he was, she would make it clear that things needed to change immediately. Laura's first day on site was not going according to plan, but she wouldn't let that derail her. After all, she was in control. Or so she thought. Laura's patience had already worn thin by the time she reached the man lifting the heavy beams. She stood a few feet away, watching him for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. His clothes were covered in dust and grime, his shirt clinging to his back from the heat of the day, and his hands, she noted with a mix of disdain and disbelief, were rough and calloused. Without hesitation, she cleared her throat, loudly enough to catch his attention. The man paused, straightened up, and turned to face her, his expression calm, almost unreadable. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and met her gaze. There was no deference in his eyes, no sign that he recognized the importance of the woman standing in front of him. That alone irked her. "Excuse me," she began, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Are you in charge here?" The man tilted his head slightly, considering her for a moment. "In a way," he replied, his tone neutral. He didn't seem particularly eager to elaborate, which only fueled Laura's irritation. "I'm Laura, the lead architect for this project," she continued, raising her chin. "I was expecting a certain level of professionalism here, but clearly, that's not the case." Her eyes swept over him disdainfully, as if his very presence was an offense to her sense of order. "The state of this site is unacceptable. Materials are scattered everywhere, there's no sense of organization, and frankly, I'm shocked that someone like you was put in charge of such an important project." The man listened quietly, his face betraying no emotion. He didn't interrupt her, nor did he seem particularly bothered by her words. When she finished, there was a brief silence as he regarded her, still holding the beam on his shoulder. "Is that so?" he finally said, his voice calm. "And what exactly do you suggest we do about it?" Laura blinked, momentarily thrown off by his lack of reaction. She had expected an apology, or at the very least, some sign of respect for her position. Instead, this man was treating her as if she were just another passerby. "Well, for starters," she said, recovering her composure, "you could ensure that the materials are properly organized. It's a basic principle of project management, something you should be familiar with, I would hope." Her tone was laced with sarcasm, a clear attempt to belittle him. To her surprise, the man only nodded thoughtfully, as if he were seriously considering her words. "I see," he said slowly. "And is there anything else?" Laura felt a flush of anger rising in her chest. Was he mocking her? She wasn't sure, but the lack of urgency in his voice was infuriating. "Yes, there's plenty more," she snapped. "You need to step up your game. This project is far too important to be left in the hands of someone so inexperienced." She eyed him critically, from his worn-out boots to his sunburned skin. "I expect this site to be running smoothly the next time I visit, or I'll be having a serious conversation with whoever hired you." The man's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He set the beam down carefully and straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "I appreciate your concerns, Miss Laura," he said evenly, "but sometimes things look different from where you're standing." His words were measured, calm, almost too calm. They hung in the air between them, unsettling her in a way she couldn't quite place. Laura opened her mouth to retort but found herself momentarily at a loss for words. There was something about the way he was looking at her, something that made her feel as though she were the one under scrutiny, not him. Before she could gather her thoughts, Maya, her assistant, approached, looking slightly flustered. "Laura, we're needed in the main office to go over the blueprints," she said, glancing between Laura and the man. Laura exhaled sharply, forcing herself to break the tense eye contact. "Fine," she said curtly. "But this conversation isn't over." The man gave her a slight nod. "I'll be here," he replied, a hint of something, amusement, perhaps, in his voice. Without another word, Laura turned on her heel and marched toward the office, Maya hurrying behind her. As they walked, Laura's mind raced, her frustration mounting. Who did that man think he was, treating her with such indifference? She was the architect, the person responsible for the entire vision of this project. And yet, that foreman had acted as if her concerns were trivial. As they neared the office, Laura made a silent vow to herself. The next time she saw him, she would make sure he understood just who he was dealing with. She wouldn't tolerate any further disrespect, especially not from someone so clearly beneath her. Paolo watched as Laura stormed off toward the main office, her assistant trailing in her wake. His expression remained neutral, but there was a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. He hadn't expected their first interaction to go quite like this, but in a way, it only confirmed what he had already suspected. Laura was talented, there was no doubt about that, but her arrogance clouded her judgment. She judged people by appearances, by status, and by their ability to fit into the world she had carefully crafted for herself. He sighed quietly and bent down to lift the beam once more, moving it to its designated spot. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him because of his simple appearance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Paolo had made a habit of dressing like any other worker on his sites. To him, it was the best way to understand how things truly operated. When people didn't know who he was, they behaved differently, more honestly. It allowed him to see the true nature of those he worked with. As the owner of one of the largest construction firms in the city, Paolo had built his business from the ground up, literally. He had started as a worker, just like the men and women he now employed. He knew what it took to run a site efficiently, and he valued the hard work that went into every project. That's why it frustrated him when people like Laura arrived, assuming they were above everyone else simply because they had a prestigious title. For Paolo, this project was personal. He had invested not just his money, but his time and effort into making sure it was done right. And now, watching Laura dismiss the workers without a second thought, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. She didn't know it yet, but he had been observing her from the moment she stepped onto the site. Her every comment, every glance, and every dismissive gesture had been noted. Paolo was patient, though. He wasn't in a rush to reveal his hand. As he continued working alongside the crew, the men around him exchanged quiet glances. They knew who Paolo really was, and though they respected his decision to keep a low profile, they also knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. There was a certain unspoken understanding between them. Paolo wasn't just their boss, he was one of them. His hands were as dirty as theirs, and that earned him their loyalty. Later that day, during a break, one of the workers, Ricardo, approached Paolo with a curious smile. "So, the architect, huh? She really let you have it?" Paolo chuckled, shaking his head. "She did, didn't she? I guess I wasn't quite what she expected." Ricardo grinned, leaning on a nearby pile of materials. "Do you think she'll figure it out?" Paolo shrugged. "She will, eventually. But not before she learns a few things." He paused, looking out over the site where the workers were diligently following his earlier instructions. "She's got talent, no doubt about that. But talent without humility doesn't go very far." Ricardo nodded, glancing back toward the main office where Laura had disappeared. "Think she'll change?" Paolo didn't answer immediately. He had seen many people like Laura in his career, people who believed their position or their education placed them above others. Some changed, but many didn't. It took more than a sharp mind to succeed in their line of work. It took heart, patience, and a willingness to see the value in every person who contributed to the bigger picture. "We'll see," Paolo said finally, his voice thoughtful. "Everyone has the potential to change. It just depends on whether or not they're willing to." Ricardo gave a small nod and headed back to work, leaving Paolo alone with his thoughts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the construction site, Paolo allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He knew the coming days would test Laura's character in ways she hadn't anticipated. And though he had no intention of humiliating her, he also wasn't going to make it easy for her. For now, he would continue as he always did, working quietly, observing, and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Laura had a lesson to learn, and Paolo was willing to wait as long as it took for her to see things from a new perspective. The next few days on site were filled with tension. Laura returned each morning with renewed determination, but something about the site continued to unsettle her. Despite her attempts to organize the chaos she saw around her, things never seemed to fall into place the way she expected. The workers followed her instructions, but there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm in their compliance. It felt as though there was an invisible wall between her and the team, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The sun beat down mercilessly one particularly hot afternoon as Laura stood over a set of blueprints, her brow furrowed in frustration. The crew was moving too slowly, in her opinion. The materials weren't being handled efficiently, and delays were already creeping into the schedule. She couldn't afford to have this project fall behind, not when it held such importance for her career. Maya, standing nearby with a clipboard, glanced nervously at her boss. "Laura, is everything all right? You seem tense." "I'm more than tense," Laura snapped, her patience wearing thin. "Look at this mess. How am I supposed to complete a project of this magnitude when no one seems to know what they're doing?" She gestured toward the workers, her voice rising. "I've given them clear instructions, but nothing's happening the way it should." Maya followed her gaze, watching the crew as they moved materials and worked on the foundation. "It doesn't seem that bad," she offered cautiously. "Maybe there's a communication issue. Perhaps we could talk to." "I know exactly what the problem is," Laura interrupted, her eyes narrowing on Paolo, who was once again hard at work alongside the others. "It's him. That so-called foreman is incompetent, and it's trickling down to the rest of the crew. How can they expect to meet deadlines when their leader doesn't seem to care?" Maya opened her mouth to respond, but Laura was already striding across the site, her heels clicking with purpose. She marched up to Paolo, who was working with a small group of men near the foundation. As she approached, Paolo looked up, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His expression remained calm, though he could see the storm brewing in Laura's eyes. "This is unacceptable," Laura began without preamble. "We're already behind schedule, and the materials are being handled inefficiently. I've been clear about what needs to be done, yet nothing is happening as it should. You're supposed to be managing this crew, but from what I can see, you're only contributing to the disorder." Paolo straightened up slowly, meeting her gaze with that same quiet intensity that had unnerved her before. "What exactly do you think I should be doing differently?" he asked, his voice calm. Laura's temper flared at his tone. It was as though he was challenging her authority, and she wouldn't stand for it. For starters, you could make sure the materials are organized properly. We're losing time because no one knows where anything is. And this, she gestured toward the foundation, where several workers were carefully positioning beams. This is taking far too long. If you don't step up and take control of this site, I'll be forced to escalate the matter to your superiors. Paolo remained silent for a moment, his eyes studying her. I understand your concerns, he said finally. But the reason the foundation is taking longer than expected is because the ground isn't as stable as we initially thought. Rushing this part of the project could cause problems later on. I'd rather take the time to do it right than risk structural issues down the line. Laura blinked, momentarily thrown off by his explanation. She hadn't considered that there might be underlying issues she wasn't aware of. But rather than admit her mistake, she doubled down. That's no excuse for the disorganization, she retorted. There's no reason the rest of the site should be in chaos. I expect better from you and your team. Paolo gave a small nod. We'll make adjustments where we can. But I'll need you to trust the process, especially with the foundation. Rushing it won't help anyone in the long run. Trust the process. The phrase grated on Laura's nerves. She was a woman of action, someone who believed in results, not excuses. Yet, standing in front of Paolo, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing something she wasn't. She hated that feeling of being out of control, of not knowing all the variables at play. Still, she wasn't about to let it show. Fine, she said tersely. But I'll be back tomorrow, and I expect to see progress. Paolo gave her a small nod, though his expression remained neutral. You will? Laura turned on her heel and walked back toward Maya, who had been watching the exchange from a distance. As she neared, Maya hesitated before speaking. Do you think, maybe he has a point? About the foundation? Laura let out a frustrated sigh. That's not the issue here, Maya. The issue is that this site isn't running the way it should be. We're losing time, and that's unacceptable. I don't care if he's right about the foundation, we can't afford these delays. Maya nodded quietly, but Laura could sense the doubt lingering in her assistant's mind. The truth was, part of Laura herself wasn't entirely convinced anymore. Something about Paolo's calm confidence unsettled her. He spoke with a level of knowledge and experience that didn't fit her initial impression of him. As the day wore on, Laura found herself returning to the blueprints, studying them with a newfound intensity. For the first time, she began to wonder if perhaps she had misjudged the situation. But the thought was fleeting, quickly pushed aside by her need to maintain control. The next morning, she would return to the site with even more determination. She couldn't afford to lose control of this project, not now, not when everything she had worked for was at stake. The next morning, Laura arrived at the construction site earlier than usual, determined to regain control of the project. The air was still cool, and the first light of dawn was just beginning to spread across the sky. She took a deep breath as she stepped out of her car, her mind set on fixing what she saw as a chaotic situation. Today would be different, she promised herself. As she walked through the site, she noticed the workers already hard at it, moving materials, setting up tools, and continuing to work on the foundation. Everything seemed to be in motion, but Laura still felt a lingering sense of unease. It was as if no matter how much she tried to impose order, something was always just out of her control. Paolo was, as usual, working among the crew, carrying equipment and directing a few of the men. He looked entirely at ease, blending in seamlessly with the workers. Once again, Laura felt a flicker of irritation at his lack of urgency. Didn't he realize how critical this project was? It baffled her how he could remain so calm when so much was at stake. As the morning wore on, Laura found herself drifting from one task to another, checking blueprints, inspecting materials, but always with one eye on Paolo. No matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him didn't add up. It wasn't just his calm demeanor, it was the way the other workers interacted with him. There was a quiet respect there, something deeper than just taking orders from a supervisor. Around mid-morning, Laura spotted Paolo standing by the foundation, speaking with a group of men. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she walked over, intending to ask about the progress. When she approached, Paolo acknowledged her with a nod but didn't stop his conversation with the workers. He spoke in low, measured tones, explaining the intricacies of how they would reinforce the foundation to ensure its stability. The workers listened intently, nodding along as he outlined the steps. There was no questioning his authority, no hesitation in following his lead. As she stood there, listening to Paolo explain the technical details of the foundation, Laura felt her irritation morph into something else, confusion. How could a foreman, someone she had initially dismissed as incompetent, have such an in-depth understanding of structural engineering? His knowledge was far beyond what she had expected, and for the first time, she began to question her initial assumptions. Once Paolo finished speaking to the workers, he turned to Laura, his expression calm as always. Is there something you'd like to discuss? He asked, his tone neutral but not unkind. Laura hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the directness of his question. She hadn't prepared herself for this kind of conversation. I just wanted to check on the progress, she said, her voice lacking the sharpness it usually carried. It seems like things are moving along, but I still don't understand why the foundation is taking so long. Paolo nodded thoughtfully, as if considering how to respond. Foundations are critical, he said. If we rush this, we risk compromising the entire structure. And I know you want this building to stand for a long time. Laura crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. Of course, but surely we could speed things up without sacrificing quality. Paolo smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had seen this kind of situation before. Sometimes speeding up isn't the solution. Sometimes, it's about understanding the process and letting it unfold naturally. You can't rush certain things, Laura. Hearing him say her name like that, with such calm authority, made Laura's chest tighten with discomfort. She had come here to assert her control, to make sure things were done her way. But now, standing in front of Paolo, she was starting to realize that maybe she didn't have as much control as she thought. As the silence stretched between them, Paolo's eyes seemed to study her, as if waiting for her to grasp the deeper meaning behind his words. You know, he continued, it's not always about doing things faster or more efficiently. Sometimes, it's about doing things right. That's the only way to make something last. Laura swallowed hard, feeling an uncomfortable mix of emotions. She wasn't sure if it was frustration, confusion, or something else entirely. All she knew was that Paolo was beginning to challenge the way she saw things, and she wasn't sure how to handle that. Without another word, Paolo turned back to the workers, resuming his instructions. Laura stood there for a moment longer, watching him, before turning and walking back toward the office, her mind buzzing with questions she didn't yet have answers to. The day had finally come for the scheduled meeting to discuss the progress of the project. Laura arrived at the construction site earlier than usual, her nerves a bundle of tension as she prepared to face the client, contractors, and supervisors. This was her chance to demonstrate her control and mastery over the project, to show that despite the challenges, everything was progressing as it should. She had meticulously prepared her notes and went over every detail multiple times, determined not to be caught off guard. The makeshift meeting room was set up in one of the site offices, with blueprints spread across the large central table. The meeting was to start in 30 minutes, and she was ready. She took her place at the table, arranging her papers neatly in front of her, preparing for a professional and structured discussion. Workers bustled outside the office as the meeting time approached, and Laura kept an eye on the door, waiting for the key players to arrive. Maya sat beside her, nervously glancing over the plans. Everything will be fine, Laura said, though her own words didn't bring her as much comfort as she'd hoped. I have everything under control. Just as the clock struck 9 a.m., the door opened, and a small group of people entered. Among them were several contractors and engineers, but one person made Laura's stomach drop. Paolo, the foreman, walked in with the same quiet confidence she had grown accustomed to seeing. He was no longer wearing his work clothes. Instead, he wore a neatly pressed suit, simple yet sophisticated, and carried himself with an air of authority that immediately set him apart. For a moment, Laura was frozen in her seat, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She had expected to meet with higher-ups today, but Paolo? Her confusion must have been evident, because one of the engineers greeted Paolo with a respectful nod and said, "Good morning, Mr. Duarte. I trust you've seen the latest reports on the foundation, Mr. Duarte?" Laura's heart began to pound in her chest. Slowly, the pieces fell into place, and she felt a wave of cold shock wash over her. Paolo wasn't the foreman. He wasn't just another worker on the site. He was the owner, the man responsible for the entire project. All those days, she had spoken to him as if he were beneath her, humiliated him, and dismissed his expertise. And now, the truth was staring her in the face. Paolo met her gaze, his expression calm as ever, but this time, there was a hint of something else in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or maybe disappointment. He took a seat at the head of the table, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, while Laura struggled to process what was happening. The meeting began, and Paolo led the discussion with the same quiet authority he had displayed on the site. He asked thoughtful questions, gave clear instructions, and discussed the project's challenges with precision. Laura remained silent for most of the meeting, her mind racing. How had she been so blind? How could she have missed the signs? Her stomach twisted as she remembered every word she had spoken to him, the way she had belittled him, assumed his incompetence, and dismissed his advice. It was all coming back to her now, and with it, the growing weight of humiliation. Halfway through the meeting, Paolo turned his attention to her. "Miss Laura," he said, his tone formal but not unkind, "I'd like to hear your thoughts on the next phase of the project." His words cut through the haze of her thoughts, snapping her back to the present moment. She forced herself to respond, though her voice was shakier than she would have liked. "Of course. We've prepared for the structural work on the upper floors, but I'm concerned about the delays we've encountered with the foundation." Paolo listened intently, giving her his full attention, but as she spoke, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her own mistakes. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price for her arrogance. When she finished, Paolo nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your concerns," he said, "and I agree that the foundation took longer than expected. But I want to remind everyone here that the integrity of this building depends on getting that part right. I would rather take a little extra time now to ensure we don't have larger problems later." Laura nodded, barely able to meet his gaze. She had heard him say this before, back when she had treated him as just another laborer. The difference now was that she couldn't dismiss his words. He wasn't just some worker with opinions, he was the owner, the man whose decisions would shape the success of this project. As the meeting progressed, Laura found it increasingly difficult to focus. Her mind was consumed with the realization of how badly she had misjudged Paolo. Every comment, every suggestion she had made was now tinged with the painful awareness of her own arrogance. She had treated him like someone beneath her, not realizing he was the very person she was supposed to impress. When the meeting finally drew to a close, Paolo stood and thanked everyone for their contributions. He turned to Laura last. "Miss Laura," he said, his voice soft but carrying weight, "I appreciate your hard work on this project. I know it hasn't been easy, but your designs are impressive, and I believe we can bring them to life, together." The words were kind, but Laura could hear the unspoken message behind them. She had been given a second chance, but only because Paolo had chosen to offer it to her. He had every right to fire her, to bring in another architect who would respect the process, but instead, he was giving her the opportunity to learn from her mistakes. Laura forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Thank you, Mr. Duarte," she said quietly. "I appreciate your understanding." As the room emptied and the others left, Laura remained behind for a moment, standing in the quiet space with the weight of her humiliation pressing down on her. She had come into this project with the belief that she was in control, that she had all the answers. But now, standing in the aftermath of her own arrogance, she realized just how much she still had to learn. The meeting had ended, but the echoes of it reverberated in Laura's mind long after everyone had left the room. She stood there, staring at the empty table, her fingers tracing the edges of the blueprints she had once been so confident about. Now, everything seemed different, like she was seeing it all through new eyes. The crushing weight of her realization settled over her like a heavy fog. She had spent days humiliating the one person she should have been learning from, and now she was left to face the consequences. Her feet felt heavy as she walked slowly toward the door, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of regret and self-recrimination. She had prided herself on her intelligence, her ability to control every aspect of a project, but somehow, in her arrogance, she had failed to see the most important truth standing right in front of her. Outside, the sun was high in the sky, casting a harsh light over the construction site. The workers moved with their usual efficiency, and everything seemed to continue as if nothing significant had happened. But for Laura, everything had changed. She couldn't look at the site in the same way. She couldn't look at Paolo in the same way. As she walked through the site, heading toward her car, she caught sight of Paolo standing with a group of workers. He was speaking quietly to them, his posture relaxed and confident, as it always was. Laura felt a sharp pang of guilt as she watched him. How had she missed it? How had she been so blind to the way he carried himself, the quiet authority he exuded? It had been there all along, but her own arrogance had kept her from seeing it. She stopped for a moment, hesitating. Every instinct in her told her to walk away, to get in her car and leave the site behind for the day. But another part of her, the part that knew she had to make things right, told her to stay. She couldn't run from this. Not if she wanted to grow, not if she wanted to be better than the person she had been over the past few days. With a deep breath, Laura turned and walked toward Paolo. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mouth felt dry. She wasn't used to apologizing, especially not in situations like this, but she knew she had to do it. Paolo had every reason to be angry with her, to dismiss her completely, yet he had shown nothing but patience. He had given her a chance to prove herself, even after the way she had treated him. Paolo looked up as she approached, his expression neutral but attentive. The workers around him shifted slightly, sensing the tension in the air. Laura stopped a few feet away, suddenly feeling incredibly small under his gaze. "Paolo," she began, her voice unsteady. I need to talk to you." He nodded once, giving a small signal to the workers, who quickly dispersed, leaving the two of them standing alone. Paolo turned his full attention to her, waiting in silence. Laura swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. About everything." Paolo didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened, and he crossed his arms, waiting for her to continue. "I judged you," Laura said, the words coming out in a rush. "I looked at you and assumed, well, I assumed you were someone who wasn't capable of handling this project. I treated you like you didn't matter, like your experience didn't matter, and I was wrong. I see that now, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Paolo's expression remained unreadable, but Laura could feel the weight of her own words settling between them. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Finally, Paolo spoke. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. "I appreciate it." Laura exhaled, the tension in her shoulders releasing just a little. But she knew this wasn't enough. "I want to do better," she said, her voice firmer now. "I want to make things right." Paolo studied her for a long moment before nodding. "That's all I ask," he said simply. Laura nodded, grateful for his understanding. As she walked away, she felt a small flicker of hope begin to grow inside her. She had made a mistake, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could learn from it. The next morning, Laura arrived at the construction site with a sense of determination that felt different from the days before. This time, it wasn't born out of frustration or a need to assert control. It was a quiet determination, one rooted in humility and a genuine desire to make things right. The apology she had given Paolo the day before had been a start, but she knew words alone wouldn't be enough to change the course of the project. She needed to prove, through her actions, that she was capable of growth. The workers were already busy as she walked onto the site, but something felt different today. The air seemed lighter, less tense. Laura greeted a few of the men she passed, nodding respectfully instead of hurrying past them as she usually did. To her surprise, they responded with nods of their own, some even offering brief smiles. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Her first stop was the foundation work, where the team was finishing the final reinforcements. Laura approached slowly, watching as the workers moved with precision, following the instructions Paolo had given them earlier in the week. She had to admit, everything was running smoothly now. The delays she had been so worried about seemed minor in comparison to the quality of the work being done. Paolo was nearby, discussing something with one of the engineers. When he spotted Laura, he finished his conversation and walked over to her, his expression calm as always. "Good morning," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "Morning," Laura replied, feeling a small surge of relief at his openness. "I've been watching the foundation work, it's going well." Paolo nodded. "The team's been working hard to make sure it's done right. We're almost ready to move on to the next phase." Laura hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I want to help. I want to be more involved in the day-to-day progress. I know I've been distant, but I'd like to change that." Paolo regarded her quietly for a moment, as if weighing her words. "Being more involved means being open to learning from the crew," he said. "They've been doing this kind of work for years. You might be surprised at what they can teach you." Laura nodded, accepting the gentle reminder. "I'm ready to learn. Whatever it takes to make this project a success." Paolo gave her a small, approving nod, and together, they walked toward the area where the next phase of the project was set to begin. As they moved through the site, Laura found herself paying closer attention to the details she had previously overlooked. The materials, the techniques, the careful coordination between the workers, it all seemed so much clearer now that she wasn't blinded by her own ego. Over the next few days, Laura made a concerted effort to immerse herself in the project. She spent more time on site, talking to the workers, asking questions, and, most importantly, listening to their answers. She watched as Paolo led by example, his calm and steady leadership style earning the respect of everyone around him. It became clear to her that true leadership wasn't about barking orders or demanding results. It was about understanding, collaboration, and knowing when to step back and let others take the lead. The workers began to notice the shift in Laura's attitude as well. She no longer looked at them with disdain or dismissed their ideas. Instead, she engaged with them, learning from their experience and offering her own expertise when needed. Slowly but surely, the tension that had once hung over the site began to dissipate. One afternoon, as she was reviewing some blueprints with the team, Ricardo, one of the senior workers, approached her with a grin. "Looks like you're finally getting the hang of things around here, Miss Laura." Laura smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "I guess I am," she admitted. "But I've still got a lot to learn." Ricardo nodded approvingly. "We all do. But the important thing is, you're trying. That's what matters." As the days passed, Laura began to feel more at ease on the site. The project, which had once felt like a source of endless frustration, now felt like a collaborative effort, a shared vision that was coming to life through the hard work of everyone involved. For the first time, she truly felt like part of the team. And though she knew there was still much work to be done, Laura also knew that she was on the right path. She had made mistakes, but she had learned from them. And that, she realized, was the true mark of growth. Weeks passed, and the construction site transformed before Laura's eyes. What had once been a chaotic scene of scattered materials and slow progress now felt like a well-oiled machine. The workers moved with a sense of purpose, and every day, the structure they had envisioned took shape, piece by piece. Laura could see it coming together, not just as a building, but as a testament to collaboration and resilience. As the final touches were added to the foundation and the upper levels of the building began to rise, Laura found herself reflecting on how far they had come, not just in terms of construction, but in terms of relationships and trust. There was a sense of pride that swelled in her chest, not only for the work she had contributed, but for the work everyone had poured into the project. She realized that without the dedication and expertise of the crew, none of this would have been possible. Paolo was a constant presence, always observing, offering guidance when needed, but allowing Laura to take the reins when it came to the design and structural decisions. His leadership had been quiet but impactful, a stark contrast to the way she had initially approached the project. She had learned so much from him, more than she ever expected. On the final day of construction, Laura stood at the site, gazing up at the nearly completed building. It was magnificent, taller and more impressive than she had even imagined. The sleek lines of the structure gleamed in the sunlight, and every detail she had worked so hard on was finally coming to life. But more than that, it symbolized something greater for her, a personal transformation, a journey of growth and humility. The workers gathered around, some packing up their tools, others chatting excitedly about the completion of the project. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, a collective understanding that they had built something lasting and meaningful. Laura felt a surge of emotion as she looked at the faces around her. These were the people who had brought her vision to life, and she was proud to be a part of it. Paolo approached her, standing by her side as they both looked up at the finished structure. He didn't say anything at first, simply observing the fruit of their labor. After a long moment, he turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "It's a beautiful building," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You did a great job, Laura." Laura smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "We did a great job," she corrected, glancing at him. "This wouldn't have been possible without you and the team." Paolo nodded, his eyes reflecting his approval. "You've come a long way since that first day on site. I wasn't sure how things would turn out back then, but you proved me wrong." She laughed softly, remembering how she had walked onto the site that first day, full of pride and ready to assert her authority. How different things were now. "I've learned a lot," she admitted, her voice tinged with humility. "Not just about construction, but about leadership, teamwork, and myself." Paolo's gaze softened. "That's the most important lesson. Buildings come and go, but the growth we experience along the way, that's what really lasts." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them absorbing the significance of what they had accomplished. For Laura, this project had started as a career-defining opportunity, but it had become so much more. It had challenged her in ways she hadn't expected, forced her to confront her own flaws, and ultimately led her to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of something bigger than herself. The workers began to gather for a final group photo, and Maya called for Laura to join them. She smiled and waved back, feeling a sense of belonging that hadn't been there at the start of the project. Before heading over, she turned to Paolo one last time. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "For everything." Paolo smiled, a rare, genuine expression that conveyed more than words could. "Thank you, Laura. You earned this." With that, Laura walked toward the group of workers, ready to celebrate not only the completion of the building, but the journey that had brought them all here. The project was finished, but the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever. As the celebration wound down, Laura found herself standing at the edge of the construction site, looking back at the now completed building. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the structure. It was beautiful, not just because of its design, but because of everything it represented. For Laura, it was more than just an architectural achievement, it was a testament to personal growth, humility, and the power of collaboration. The workers had all left, and the site was quiet now, save for the soft rustling of the wind. Laura took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey she had been on lift from her shoulders. She had come into this project with arrogance, believing that her expertise and authority would be enough to carry her through. But now, she understood that true leadership was about more than just knowledge. It was about listening, learning, and trusting the people around you. As she stood there, reflecting on everything she had learned, Paolo walked up beside her, his hands in his pockets, looking up at the building one last time. He didn't say anything for a moment, simply letting the quiet settle between them. Then, he turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You've done well, Laura," he said softly. "Not just with the building, but with everything." Laura smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Paolo. I couldn't have done it without your guidance." Paolo shook his head. "You had it in you all along. You just needed to see things from a different perspective." They stood in silence for a few more moments, watching as the last rays of sunlight illuminated the building. The future felt bright, full of possibility. Laura knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready for them, not just because of her skills as an architect, but because of the lessons she had learned about herself. "I'm looking forward to the next project," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. Paolo smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. "So am I." With that, Laura walked away from the site, her heart lighter and her mind clearer than it had been in a long time. She had completed the building, but more importantly, she had built something within herself that would last a lifetime. Laura, a confident and ruthless architect, believed she had everything under control until the moment she humiliated someone she thought was a simple bricklayer. But what would you do if you discovered that the person you despised is actually the owner of everything around you? Will Laura be able to deal with the consequences of her pride and rebuild her reputation, or will she have destroyed everything she values most? Click on the video that appears on the screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and find out how this story ends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of impactful stories like this. See you there.